What if the worst night of your life became the moment everything changed? Imagine this. A man, smug and self-satisfied, takes his young mistress to a lavish dinner. He's celebrating his new life built on the ruins of his marriage. But then he looks across the restaurant. He sees his ex-wife, the woman he discarded, the woman he told was holding him back. And she's not crying. She's not alone. She's sitting with one of the most powerful men in the country, and he's slipping a diamond ring on her finger. This isn't just a story about revenge. It's a story about betrayal, rediscovery, and the stunning moment when a shattered life is rebuilt into an empire. The Chianti was a deep, arrogant red, clinging to the sides of Daniel Foster's glass like a velvet shroud. He swirled it with a practiced flick of the wrist, a gesture he'd perfected from watching senior partners at his investment firm. Everything tonight was about perfection, about signaling. The restaurant, Aria, was a fortress of quiet wealth, where a single entree cost more than his first car payment. The woman across from him, Chloe Jensen, was a testament to his perceived success. 26, with sharp, ambitious eyes and a laugh that was just a little too loud, a little too eager. She was his upgrade. "To us," Dan said, raising his glass. The crystal chimed against hers, a clean, sharp sound in the hushed room. "To new beginnings." Chloe's smile was radiant, reflecting the candlelight. "I can't believe we're finally here, Dan. Openly. No more sneaking around." "The divorce was finalized last week," he said, the words tasting like liberation. "Clean break. Alice was surprisingly agreeable in the end." He took a sip of wine, the lie coating his tongue. It hadn't been agreeable. It had been brutal. Months of Alice's quiet, devastating tears, of her hollowed-out eyes following him as he packed his suits. He'd told her it was for the best, that they'd grown apart. He'd told her she'd become complacent, that her small world of art, history books and local gallery shows was suffocating his ambition. He didn't tell her about Chloe, his junior analyst, who saw him not as a husband, but as a vice president with a corner office and a future. "Is she doing okay?" Chloe asked, a flicker of something, pity, morbid curiosity, in her eyes. Dan shrugged, feigning indifference. "Honestly, I don't know. She'll be fine. She has her little hobbies, probably moved back in with her parents." The image was both satisfying and pathetic. Alice, back in her childhood bedroom in Sacramento, surrounded by dusty art prints. It confirmed his narrative. He had escaped. He was moving up while she was retreating. He was in the middle of explaining the complex genius of his latest portfolio strategy when a movement across the dining room caught his eye. A couple was being seated at one of the prime tables by the panoramic window overlooking the San Francisco Bay. The man was tall, with a mane of silver hair that bespoke power, not age. He wore a tailored suit that probably cost more than Dan's entire wardrobe. Dan recognized him instantly from the cover of Forbes, Nathaniel Sterling. A titan of sustainable technology, a genuine billionaire, not just a wannabe like the men Dan worked for. And then the woman with him turned toward the light. The wine glass in Dan's hand froze halfway to his lips. His heart seized, a painful, stuttering clap in his chest. It couldn't be. The room, with its soft lighting and clinking silverware, seemed to warp, to bend around her image. It was Alice, but it wasn't the Alice he remembered. The woman he'd left was a creature of soft cardigans and weary resignation. This Alice was luminous. Her mousy brown hair, which he'd always urged her to dye, was styled in elegant waves that caught the light. She wore a simple, sleeveless black dress that showcased toned arms and a confidence he'd never seen. She wasn't wearing much makeup. She never did. But her face, once clouded by a quiet sorrow, was clear and serene. She laughed at something Sterling said, and the sound, though he couldn't hear it from across the room, seemed to echo in his memory. A full, genuine laugh he hadn't heard in years. "Dan, is something wrong?" Chloe's voice sliced through his shock. He couldn't speak. He just stared. Alice, his Alice, was sitting with Nathaniel Sterling. It made no sense. It was a glitch in the universe. How did she even know a man like that? Her world was small, provincial. Had she won some sort of contest? Was she his distant cousin? He watched them, his own dinner forgotten. Sterling was completely focused on her, his gaze intense and admiring. He listened, truly listened, as she spoke, her hands moving gracefully to emphasize a point. Dan had always tuned her out when she talked about her art, about the symbolism in some obscure Renaissance painting. Sterling, however, leaned in, captivated. A cold dread, sharp and acidic, began to curdle in Dan's stomach. This wasn't a chance meeting. This wasn't a professional dinner. The intimacy between them was palpable, a quiet energy that radiated from their table. Chloe followed his gaze. Wow. Isn't that Nathaniel Sterling? Who is that woman with him? She asked, a hint of envy in her tone. Dan's jaw tightened. I have no idea, he lied, the words feeling like gravel in his mouth. He couldn't tear his eyes away. He felt like a ghost at his own feast, his perfect, curated evening ruined by a spectre from his past. But she wasn't a ghost. She was more alive than he had ever seen her. The power imbalance that had defined the end of their marriage, his ambition, her stagnation, had been violently, impossibly inverted. The waiter arrived with their main courses. Dan stared blankly at the perfectly seared scallops on his plate. He felt a primal, possessive anger rise in him. That was his wife. She was supposed to be mourning him, not dining with billionaires. She was supposed to be the quiet, sad backstory to his triumphant new life. And then, the moment that shattered his world completely. Nathaniel Sterling reached across the table and took Alice's hand. He said something Dan couldn't hear, his expression a mixture of profound seriousness and gentle affection. Alice's eyes widened, her lips parting in a silent gasp. A soft blush rose on her cheeks. Slowly, deliberately, Sterling reached into his jacket pocket. He produced a small velvet box. He opened it. Even from across the room, Dan saw the impossible flash of light as the diamond caught the candle's flame. It wasn't a spark, it was a sun. He watched as Nathaniel Sterling, a man who could buy and sell Dan's entire company without a second thought, proposed to Alice Callahan Foster, his ex-wife, the quiet, agreeable woman he had so carelessly discarded. Alice stared at the ring, then at Sterling, her eyes filling with tears. She nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. A smile, brighter and more beautiful than any he had ever seen on her face, bloomed. Dan felt the blood drain from his face. His carefully constructed world, the impressive restaurant, the beautiful young mistress, the narrative of his own success, crumbled into dust. He wasn't the winner. He wasn't even in the game. He was just a man in an expensive restaurant watching his past become someone else's spectacular future. 3 months before the night at Aria, Alice Callahan was covered in dust. Not the gentle domestic dust of a neglected home, but the ancient, chalky dust of history. She was perched on a scaffold in a cavernous, forgotten ballroom in a landmark Pacific Heights mansion, painstakingly cleaning a century-old fresco. This was her sanctuary, the place she had fled to after the implosion of her marriage. The divorce had felt like an amputation. For 12 years, she had been one half of a whole, Dan and Alice. Her identity had been inextricably linked to his. She was the supportive wife of the ambitious finance guy, the one who organized the dinner parties, remembered his clients' birthdays, and kept her own passions neatly confined to the role of a hobbyist. Her degree in architectural history and preservation was something she dabbled in, a quaint interest that Dan found charming until he found it boring. When he'd finally confessed, not to the affair, but to his profound unhappiness, his words had been surgical in their cruelty. "I need more, Alice. I'm climbing and I feel like you're just standing still. This world you love, it's all about the past. I'm trying to build a future." He had made her feel like a relic, an anchor. After he left, the silence in their perfectly minimalist condo was deafening. Every sleek, modern surface they had chosen together seemed to mock her, so she'd left. She found a small, sun-filled apartment in the Mission District, a place with old bones and character. And she had called her old professor, who connected her with the Sterling Foundation's Historical Preservation Initiative. The work was painstaking, underpaid, and utterly glorious. Wiping a layer of grime from a painted cherub's face, she felt more herself than she had in a decade. Here, the past wasn't a burden, it was a treasure to be uncovered. She met Nathaniel Sterling on a damp Tuesday afternoon. He often visited the sites his foundation funded, arriving without fanfare. She was on the floor, cataloguing salvaged plaster moldings, when a pair of well-worn leather boots stopped beside her. "The detail on that acanthus leaf is extraordinary," a deep voice said. Alice looked up, shielding her eyes. A tall, silver-haired man was looking down at her, not with the detached air of a patron, but with the focused curiosity of an enthusiast. "They don't make them like this anymore," she replied, her voice slightly hoarse from the dust. "Everything is mass-produced now. There's no soul in it." He crouched down beside her, his expensive suit jacket bunching at the knees without a hint of concern. "My grandfather was a stonemason," he said, running a gentle finger over a piece of molding. "He used to say that buildings have memories. You just have to be quiet enough to hear them." That was the beginning. It wasn't a whirlwind, it was a slow, quiet unfolding. He would visit the site, ostensibly to check on the project's progress, but they would end up talking for hours. He was fascinated by her knowledge, by the passion that lit up her face when she explained the chemical composition of 19th-century milk paint or the structural genius of a flying buttress. He never once mentioned her divorce or her past. He was interested in the person she was right now, the woman covered in plaster dust who could see the soul in a building. For the first time in years, Alice felt seen. Not as an accessory or a support system, but as an expert, a professional, an equal. Their first real date was to a dusty archive at UC Berkeley to look at original blueprints of the mansion, followed by greasy, delicious tacos from a food truck. He was nothing like the ruthless corporate raider portrayed in the media. He was thoughtful, patient, and possessed a dry wit that took her by surprise. He told her about his late wife, who had passed away from cancer 5 years prior, and the philanthropic work that now gave his life purpose. He saw the strength in her that Dan had dismissed as passivity. He called her resilience, a superpower. "You're not rebuilding a life, Alice," he told her one evening as they walked along the Embarcadero, the city lights twinkling on the water. "You're excavating the one that was there all along." The evening he proposed, he told her he wanted to take her somewhere special to celebrate the completion of the ballroom fresco. Aria was his choice, and while its opulence made her a little uncomfortable, she felt a thrill at dressing up, at seeing the look of undisguised admiration in his eyes when he picked her up. Sitting across from him, she felt a sense of peace that was still novel. The trauma of Dan's betrayal had receded, leaving behind not a scar, but a smooth, new layer of skin. She was telling Nathaniel about her dream of starting her own firm, one that specialized in breathing life back into historic homes. "I'd be your first investor," he said, his smile warm. "I want to do it on my own," she countered gently. "I need to." He nodded, his respect for her obvious. "I know." It was then that he reached for her hand. His was warm and strong, enveloping hers. "Alice," he began, his voice dropping slightly. "I've spent the last 5 years living in the past, honoring a memory. I thought that was all that was left for me. And then I met you. You don't just honor the past, you bring it back to life. You've brought me back to life." Her heart began to beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "I know this is fast," he continued, his gaze unwavering, "and the last thing I want is to rush you. But I've never been more certain of anything. I love you, Alice Callahan. I love your mind, your passion, and the quiet strength that you probably don't even see in yourself. I want to build a future with you." He pulled out the box. As he opened it, revealing a stunning, vintage-inspired ring with a brilliant, clear diamond, Alice's breath caught. It wasn't a gaudy trophy. It was elegant, timeless. It looked like something she would have chosen herself. In that moment, her peripheral vision registered a familiar shape across the room. A man with Dan's haircut, sitting with a younger woman. A flicker of recognition, a ghost of a memory. But it didn't matter. The past was a faint, blurry image in the rearview mirror. Her future was sitting right in front of her, his heart in his eyes. Tears of pure, unadulterated joy welled. She wasn't the woman who was left behind. She was the woman who had been found. "Yes," she whispered, the word feeling like the most definitive, powerful statement she had ever made. "Nathaniel, yes." The drive back to his sleek, impersonal apartment in the marina was silent. The air in Dan's BMW was thick with a toxic mixture of Chloe's confused indignation and his own seething humiliation. "I don't understand what just happened," Chloe finally said as he swerved onto the freeway, cutting off a Prius. "You saw someone you knew. You looked like you'd seen a ghost." "It was nothing," Dan snapped, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Just a former colleague." "That woman? She looked familiar?" Chloe pressed, not ready to let it go. "I said it was nothing!" he roared, the sound echoing in the confined space. Chloe flinched, her carefully constructed poise shattering. She sank back into the leather seat, silent for the rest of the ride. Back in the apartment, the one he'd chosen because of its panoramic views and proximity to the yacht club he hoped to one day join, Dan poured himself a large glass of scotch. He ignored Chloe as she moved around the living room, her earlier ebullience replaced by a wary tension. He couldn't get the image out of his head. Alice's smile, Sterling's hand on hers, the blinding glare of that diamond. It played on a loop, a motion picture of his own failure. He'd thrown away a Honda and she'd been picked up by a Bugatti. The metaphor was crude, but it was the only language his ego understood. His mind raced, trying to piece together an impossible puzzle. How? When? Where? He and Alice had shared a life for 12 years. He knew her entire social circle, a handful of quiet academics, a few married couples from their old suburban neighborhood, her parents. None of them could get within 1,000 feet of Nathaniel Sterling. He pulled out his phone, his fingers slick with sweat. He searched Alice's name. Nothing. She'd deleted her social media years ago, calling it a marketplace of curated envy. The irony was nauseating. Then he searched for Nathaniel Sterling. The search results were a litany of his triumphs, articles in the Wall Street Journal, profiles in Wired, photos of him shaking hands with presidents and philanthropists. He scrolled deeper, looking for personal details. He was a widower, extremely private. And then, a recent article from a local society blog about the Sterling Foundation's new preservation projects. Dan's blood ran cold. He clicked the link. There it was, a photo from a month ago, a group of people in hard hats standing in front of a dilapidated mansion, and in the center, next to Sterling, was Alice. She was dusty and smiling, looking more vibrant than she had in the last 5 years of their marriage. The caption identified her as the project's lead restoration consultant. He'd mocked her hobby, her degree he'd paid for but never respected. He'd told her it was a waste of time. And that very hobby, that very passion he had crushed, had been her bridge into a world he could only dream of entering. "So that was her," Chloe said softly from the doorway. He hadn't realized she was watching him. "Your ex-wife." Dan didn't look up from his phone. "Yes. You told me she was simple, that she was probably living with her parents." Chloe's voice was laced with a new, sharp accusation. "She didn't look simple, Dan, and she sure as hell wasn't in Sacramento." "Things change," he muttered, the words tasting like ash. "You lied to me," Chloe said, her voice rising. "You built this whole story about how you were escaping this sad little life, but that woman looked happier than I've ever seen you." The truth in her words was a physical blow. He slammed his phone down on the granite countertop. "What do you want from me, Chloe? It's a fluke. She got lucky. He's probably just using her. a rich old man looking for a quiet, pliable young wife. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. He'd seen the look in Sterling's eyes. It was genuine admiration. It was the way Dan had looked at Alice once, a lifetime ago, before his ambition had poisoned everything. The next day at work was a blur. He couldn't focus on the market analytics flashing across his screens. Every number, every rising and falling line seemed to mock him. He was a numbers guy, a man who calculated risk and reward, and he had just made the single worst trade of his life. He found himself compulsively searching for more information. He created a fake social media profile and started following the Sterling Foundation, the Architectural Preservation Societies, anything that might give him a glimpse into her new life. He became a digital voyeur, watching from the shadows as she blossomed. His colleagues noticed the change. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by a distracted, irritable energy. "Foster, you with us?" His boss, Mark, barked during a team meeting. "Your projections for the quarter are sloppy." Dan mumbled an apology, his mind elsewhere. He was imagining Alice walking through Sterling's penthouse, sitting on his yacht, flying in his private jet. The life he craved, the status he had betrayed his marriage for, she had obtained it effortlessly, simply by being herself. The self he had told her was not enough. His relationship with Chloe began to fray. She saw the obsession in his eyes, the way he was constantly on his phone, the way Alice's name would slip into their conversations. The glamour of their affair was gone, replaced by the ugly reality of his insecurity. "You're not even here, are you?" she confronted him one night. "You're with her, in your head. You don't want me. You just want what she has." He couldn't deny it. Chloe had been a symbol of his ascent, but now Alice was engaged to a billionaire. In the brutal social mathematics that governed his world, Chloe was no longer an asset. She was a reminder of his spectacular miscalculation. He had traded a masterpiece for a print, only to watch the masterpiece get acquired by the most prestigious museum in the world. And it was driving him insane. The days following the proposal were a surreal blend of private joy and public speculation. Nathaniel's engagement to a relative unknown was headline news for the city's gossip columns. They called Alice a mystery woman, a Cinderella story. They dug up her old defunct photography blog and printed pictures of her in college. Alice found it all deeply unsettling. She had spent the last year meticulously rebuilding her privacy, her sense of self, away from the prying eyes of the world. Now she was a person of interest. Nathaniel was her anchor through the storm. He shielded her, handling the press with a calm, dismissive grace, and more importantly, he listened to her fears. "They're painting me as a gold digger," she confessed one evening, curled up on the sofa in his library, a room so vast and filled with books that it had made her weep with joy the first time she saw it. "They don't know anything about me, about my work." "The people who matter know," he said, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "And soon everyone else will too." He handed her a thick, leather-bound portfolio. "I had my team draw this up." She opened it. Inside were the incorporation documents, business plan, and preliminary branding for Callahan Restoration and Design, her name in elegant, strong lettering. It was the firm she had described to him, the dream she had nurtured in secret for years. Her eyes filled with tears. "Nathaniel, this is all you, Alice," he said firmly. "Your vision, your expertise. I told you I wanted to be your first investor. This isn't a gift. It's a business proposition. I'm investing in the best restoration consultant I've ever met." He tapped a page. "And your first contract is waiting for your signature." It was the commission for the Presidio Landmark Project, a massive multi-year undertaking to restore a series of historic officers' quarters into a luxury boutique hotel. It was a career-making project, a contract she wouldn't have had a chance at for another 20 years, if ever. The offer was both exhilarating and terrifying. It was everything she wanted, handed to her on a silver platter by the man she was going to marry. The ghost of Dan's voice whispered in her ear, See? You can't do it on your own. You need a man to rescue you. She looked at Nathaniel, at the earnest belief in his eyes. He wasn't rescuing her. He was empowering her. He was opening a door that her talent deserved, a door that had been unjustly closed. Dan had wanted her to stay small, to make him feel big. Nathaniel wanted her to be as big as she could possibly be, because he was already a giant, and giants aren't intimidated by the sun. "Okay," she breathed, "but I'm paying back every cent of the seed money, with interest." His smile was brilliant. "I'd expect nothing less." Throwing herself into the work was her salvation. She hired a small, brilliant team of architects and artisans she had met over the years. She spent her days on site in steel-toed boots and a hard hat, her evenings poring over blueprints and budgets. For the first time, her passion had a real-world, high-stakes outlet. She was no longer a hobbyist, she was a CEO. Her relationship with Nathaniel deepened in the spaces between her frantic work schedule. He never complained about her long hours. Instead, he'd show up at the work site with a picnic basket for dinner or leave a thermos of her favorite tea on her desk in the morning. He celebrated her victories, a rare tile sourced, a complex structural problem solved, with more enthusiasm than he showed for his own billion-dollar deals. They were building something together, but it wasn't just a shared life. It was a shared ethos. They both believed in honoring the past to build a better future. They were partners in the truest sense of the word. One afternoon, while inspecting a shipment of reclaimed timber, her phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. She almost ignored it, but a strange instinct made her answer. "Alice?" The voice was thin, reedy, stripped of its usual bravado. It was Dan. Her blood turned to ice. She hadn't heard his voice in almost a year. "How did you get this number?" she asked, her tone flat and cold. I called your mother. I was worried. I saw the news. Alice, we need to talk." "No, we don't," she said, turning away from her foreman to hide the sudden tremor in her hands. "We have nothing to talk about." "Please," he begged, and the desperation in his voice was sickeningly real. "Just 5 minutes. For old time's sake. I saw you that night at the restaurant. I need to understand." She should have hung up. She should have blocked his number. But a perverse, morbid curiosity took hold. What could he possibly have to say? "Fine," she said, her voice like steel. "The coffee shop on Chestnut. Tomorrow. 10 minutes. Then I'm done, Dan. Forever." Hanging up, she felt a profound wave of nausea. The past, which she thought she had buried under layers of plaster dust and new love, had just clawed its way back to the surface. The coffee shop was neutral territory, a place with no memories. Alice chose a small table in the back corner, positioning herself like a general surveying a battlefield. She arrived early, armed with the armor of her new life. A sharply tailored blazer, a leather portfolio filled with contracts, and a quiet confidence that felt blessedly real. She ordered a black coffee, its bitterness a welcome jolt. Dan was late. It was a classic power move, one he used to employ in their marriage, making her wait to reinforce his own importance. But today, it just seemed pathetic. When he finally walked in, he was a ghost of the man she'd known. His expensive suit seemed to hang off him. His face was pale and drawn, and there were dark circles under his eyes. The swagger was gone, replaced by a twitchy, nervous energy. He spotted her and approached the table with a hesitant, almost apologetic shuffle. "Alice," he said, his voice husky, "thanks for coming." "I have a meeting at 11, she stated, not inviting him to sit. "What do you want, Daniel?" Using his full name was a deliberate act of distancing. He sank into the opposite chair anyway. "You look incredible," he stammered, his eyes scanning her, taking in the clothes, the poise. It wasn't a compliment, it was an assessment. He was recalculating her value. "Let's not waste time on pleasantries," she said, her voice cold. "You wanted to understand. There's nothing to understand. My life moved on. You should try it." "How did this happen?" he asked, leaning forward, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. Nathaniel Sterling. I mean, how does someone like you end up with someone like him? The insult, wrapped in a question, was so typical of him. Someone like you. Small, unimportant. A year ago, that question would have broken her. It would have affirmed the deepest, darkest insecurity he had so carefully cultivated in her, that she was not enough. But today, it was different. Someone like me, she repeated, a wry, humorless smile touching her lips. You mean a woman with a postgraduate degree in her field, a woman who now runs her own company and is managing a multi-million-dollar historic restoration project? She paused, letting the words hang in the air between them. Or did you just mean the woman who wasted 12 years supporting a man who saw her as a domestic accessory? Dan flinched as if she'd slapped him. That's not fair, Alice. Fair? Her voice rose slightly, drawing a glance from a nearby table. You want to talk about fair? Was it fair when you were having an affair with your junior analyst while I was at home, proofreading your reports and planning a future you had no intention of sharing with me? His face went white. How did you know? I'm not stupid, Dan. I was just in love. There's a difference. I found the hotel receipts in your travel expense report 6 months before you left. I just hoped I was wrong. The confession felt strangely empowering, admitting her own willful blindness. He was speechless. The narrative he had built of a gentle, amicable parting of ways had been a lie to soothe his own conscience. He had been caught, and the knowledge stripped him of the last of his defenses. I'm sorry, he whispered, the words sounding hollow and inadequate. I was a fool. I see that now. I see what I threw away. His eyes were pleading. Is it real? With him? Does he make you happy? My happiness is no longer your business, she said, her voice softening, not with forgiveness, but with a profound sense of closure. She stood up, placing a $10 bill on the table for her coffee. What I had with you, Dan, was a life built around your potential. What I have now is a life built around my own. She looked down at him, at this man who had once been the center of her universe. He looked small and diminished, a king who had abdicated his throne only to find himself a beggar at the gates of a new and more magnificent kingdom. She felt a surprising, cleansing wave of pity. Goodbye, Daniel, she said, and walked out of the coffee shop without looking back, the bell above the door chiming a final, definitive end. She drove straight to the Presidio, needing the solace of her work. She walked through the skeletal remains of the old buildings, the scent of sawdust and history filling her lungs. The encounter had shaken her, but it hadn't broken her. It had been a test, and she had passed. That evening, she told Nathaniel everything. She didn't edit or soften the details. She laid the ugliness of her past bare, expecting, perhaps, a flicker of doubt or jealousy in his eyes. Instead, he listened with his customary quiet intensity. When she was finished, he was silent for a long moment. I'm sorry you had to go through that, he said finally, his voice thick with empathy. He must be in a very dark place to try and poison your present with your past. He took her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles. But he failed, didn't he? Yes, she said, a feeling of profound relief washing over her. He did. Good, Nathaniel said, his grip tightening reassuringly. Because our future is far too bright to let any shadows in. His support wasn't possessive or angry. It was solid, unwavering, and absolute. And in that moment, Alice knew that her new foundation wasn't just built on her own strength, but on the bedrock of a love that was real, respectful, and true. Dan watched Alice walk out of the coffee shop, the finality of her departure settling over him like a shroud. Her pity was worse than her anger. Anger would have meant he still mattered, that he could still evoke a powerful emotion in her. Pity meant he was irrelevant. The confrontation, which he had hoped would give him some sense of control or understanding, had only deepened his despair. She knew about Chloe. She had known all along. His grand betrayal wasn't a secret he'd kept. It was a wound she had silently nursed. He stumbled through the rest of his day in a fog of self-recrimination. At the office, he stared at his terminal, but the numbers were just meaningless squiggles. He saw Alice's face, heard her words, "A life built around my own." The phrase haunted him. He had always been the sun in their solar system, and she the quiet planet in his orbit. He had never considered that she might have her own gravitational pull. That night, his unraveling accelerated. He and Chloe were supposed to attend a gallery opening, the kind of event he now felt was essential for networking, but he couldn't bring himself to go. "I'm not feeling up to it," he told her, loosening his tie as he walked through the door of his apartment. Chloe was already dressed, wearing a sleek silver dress that he had once found excitingly modern. Now it just looked cold. "What's wrong with you, Dan?" she demanded, her patience finally gone. "Ever since that night at Aria, you've been a ghost. You're obsessed. Did you see her today? Is that where you were?" The accusation hit too close to home. "It's none of your business," he snarled. "It is my business," she shot back, her voice trembling with frustration. "My life is tangled up in yours now. I blew up my career prospects at the firm for you. Everyone knows I'm Dan's girl. You made promises, a partnership, a future. But all you talk about, all you think about, is her." "That's not true," he lied, but the denial was weak, unconvincing. "Isn't it?" Chloe's laugh was brittle. "You know, I found something interesting when I was cleaning out some of your old files from the office." She walked over to her purse and pulled out a folded, crumpled piece of paper. It was an internal memo from the firm, dated over a year ago. She unfolded it and began to read aloud. "Following the final round of interviews, the partners have decided to offer the senior VP position to Mark Holloway. We thank Daniel Foster for his application and encourage him to continue his development within the firm." She looked up at him, her eyes gleaming with a cold, hard clarity. "This is dated the week before you first asked me out for a drink, Dan. The week you started telling Alice how she was holding you back." The air left Dan's lungs. He had been passed over for the promotion he'd told Alice was a sure thing. His failure had been a deep, burning shame, a secret he had guarded jealously. He couldn't bear for Alice, who had so much faith in him, to see that he had hit a ceiling. So instead of admitting his own inadequacy, he had manufactured a crisis. He had blamed her. He had created a narrative where she was the anchor and he was the ship straining to sail. Chloe had just been the most convenient escape raft. "You didn't leave her because you wanted a bigger future," Chloe said, her voice dripping with contempt. "You left her because you failed and you couldn't stand for her to see it. You needed someone new, someone who didn't know you'd been rejected. You needed an audience for a story that wasn't even true." Every word was a nail in his coffin. She saw him. She saw the pathetic, insecure man behind the bravado. "I loved you," he said, the words feeling pathetic and desperate. "No, you didn't," Chloe replied, shaking her head. "You loved what I represented, a new start, a win, but you lost, Dan. You lost the promotion, and you lost the only person who probably ever loved you for who you actually were, not who you pretended to be." She walked to the bedroom and returned a few minutes later with her suitcase. It was already packed. "I'm done," she said, her voice flat. "I'm not going to be a supporting character in your pathetic psychodrama. You can sit here and obsess over Alice Callahan's new life, but I'm going to go find one of my own." She walked to the door, her heels clicking decisively on the hardwood floor. She didn't look back. The door closed with a soft final click, leaving Dan alone in the vast, empty apartment. The panoramic view of the city, once a symbol of his ambition, now felt like 1,000 judging eyes. He was utterly alone. He had no wife, no mistress, no promotion. He had torched his entire life for the sake of his ego, and now even that was gone, burned to ash by the brilliant, blinding light of Alice's success and his own catastrophic failure. He sank onto the expensive sofa, the silence pressing in on him, a physical weight. He had nothing left but the ghost of the man he thought he was, and the horrifying reality of the man he had become. The Sterling Foundation's annual charity gala was the most anticipated event on the San Francisco social calendar. It was held in the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel, a space Alice knew intimately from her studies. This year, however, she wasn't an academic observer. She was attending on the arm of the foundation's chairman, her fiancé. She wore a deep sapphire gown that Nathaniel had insisted on buying for her, claiming it matched her eyes. For the first time in her life, she felt comfortable in such opulent surroundings, not because of the dress or the diamonds sparkling at her throat, but because she was there on her own terms. Callahan Restoration and Design was a sponsor of the event, her company's logo displayed proudly on the program. She was a guest, a donor, and a business owner. The evening was a whirlwind of introductions to senators, tech CEOs, and philanthropists. Nathaniel introduced her not as his fiancée, but as Alice Callahan, the brilliant mind behind the Presidio Landmark project. He radiated pride, and it filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the champagne she was sipping. She was in the middle of a conversation with a renowned art critic when she felt a sudden chill, a primal sense of being watched. She scanned the crowded ballroom, and her heart stopped. Leaning against a marble pillar near the entrance was Dan. He was horrifically out of place. He wore a rented tuxedo that was slightly too tight in the shoulders, and his face had a waxy, unhealthy pallor. He was drinking whiskey, not champagne, and his eyes were fixed on her with a burning, desperate intensity. She felt a jolt of fear. How had he gotten in? A ticket to this event cost $10,000. She excused herself and moved swiftly to Nathaniel's side. "Nathaniel," she whispered, her voice tight. "Dan is here." Nathaniel's calm expression didn't change, but his eyes hardened. He subtly signaled one of his security team, a discreet man in a dark suit. "Where?" "By the entrance. I don't know what he's doing here. He looks unwell." Before Nathaniel could respond, Dan began to move toward them, weaving through the glittering crowd with a clumsy, determined gait. He was heading straight for the stage, where the auction was about to begin. "Oh no," Alice breathed. Dan reached the low stage and before anyone could stop him, grabbed the microphone from its stand. A feedback squeal echoed through the ballroom, causing the chatter to die down. Hundreds of faces turned toward him. "Good evening, everyone," Dan said, his voice amplified, slurring slightly. "Good evening, San Francisco's finest." He gave a mock bow. Nathaniel's security guard started moving in, but Nathaniel held up a hand, stopping him. "Let's see what he has to say," he murmured to Alice, his arm a solid, reassuring presence around her waist. "We're all here tonight to celebrate philanthropy," Dan continued, his eyes locking onto Alice. "To celebrate men like Nathaniel Sterling, who build schools and save buildings." He laughed, a short, ugly bark. "But do you ever wonder about the cost? What gets bulldozed to make way for these grand gestures?" He pointed a shaking finger at Alice. "I do. I know. Because that woman right there, Alice Callahan, my ex-wife, she knows a thing or two about demolition. She demolished our marriage, our home, our future, all for a shot at this." He gestured around the opulent room. "She played the part of the devoted wife while she was hunting for bigger game. She's a predator in sheep's clothing, a gold digger of the highest order." A collective gasp went through the room. The silence was absolute, suffocating. Alice felt the blood drain from her face. Every eye was on her, 1,000 points of judgment. She felt naked, exposed, the carefully constructed walls of her new life crumbling under the force of his public assault. But then she looked at Nathaniel. He wasn't looking at Dan. He was looking at her, his expression not one of doubt or shame, but of unwavering support. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if to say, "You've got this." And in that moment, something inside her shifted. The fear and humiliation receded, replaced by a cold, clear anger. Not at Dan, but at herself, for ever letting this man have such power over her. She gently removed Nathaniel's arm from her waist and took a step forward. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was clear and carried the weight of absolute authority. "He's right," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. The crowd murmured. Dan looked momentarily triumphant. "My ex-husband is right," Alice continued, her gaze fixed on Dan. "I do know about demolition. I know what it's like to have your sense of self demolished, to have your confidence bulldozed, to have your trust in another person reduced to rubble. I lived in that rubble for a very long time, Dan. You were the architect of that demolition." She began to walk slowly toward the stage, her sapphire gown whispering against the marble floor. "And you're right about something else. I was hunting. Not for money. Not for status. I was hunting for the woman I was before I met you. The woman who was passionate and strong and had dreams of her own, dreams you told me were small and insignificant." She stopped at the foot of the stage, looking up at the pathetic, unraveling figure he had become. "I didn't find that woman again by meeting Nathaniel Sterling," she said, her voice ringing with the truth. "I found her on my hands and knees, covered in plaster dust, bringing a forgotten piece of beauty back to life. I found her when I signed the lease on my own apartment, when I incorporated my own business, when I realized my worth was not determined by my husband's approval." She looked out at the silent, captivated audience. "I am with Nathaniel because he, unlike some, is not intimidated by a woman's strength. He celebrates it. He invests in it. The only gold digger here tonight, Daniel, is you. You dug for gold in our marriage, and when you couldn't find enough to satisfy your ego, you tried to dig it out of my soul. But my soul is not for sale." Two security guards finally reached Dan, each taking an arm. He didn't resist. His face was a mask of utter defeat. All the fight had gone out of him, leaving behind a hollow, broken shell. As they led him away, his eyes met Alice's one last time. In them, she saw the devastating final recognition of what he had truly lost. It wasn't a wife or a fortune. It was himself. The ballroom erupted in applause. It started with one person, then another, until the entire room was on its feet, the sound a roaring wave of validation. Alice stood her ground, tears streaming down her face, but she was not crying from sadness or humiliation. She was crying from the sheer, unadulterated relief of being, finally and completely, free. Chapter 8. The Restoration. 6 months passed. The Presidio landmark project was ahead of schedule and under budget, a testament to Alice's meticulous planning and leadership. Callahan Restoration and Design had become the most sought-after preservation firm on the West Coast. Her days were filled with the satisfying challenges of her work, the thrill of discovering original hidden details in a building, the camaraderie of her team, the quiet pride of creating something beautiful and lasting. The gala incident had, paradoxically, cemented her reputation. The story of her public stand had circulated through the city, not as a piece of juicy gossip, but as a legend. She was no longer Nathaniel Sterling's mysterious fiancée. She was Alice Callahan, a woman of substance and strength. Her relationship with Nathaniel had settled into a beautiful, easy rhythm. Their love was a quiet, sturdy thing, built not on grand gestures, but on shared mornings with coffee and blueprints, on evenings spent in comfortable silence reading in the library, on the unwavering respect they had for each other's minds and passions. One crisp Saturday morning, Nathaniel drove her to a quiet, wooded plot of land in Marin County, overlooking the bay. An old, dilapidated Victorian farmhouse, beautiful in its decay, stood silhouetted against the morning fog. "What is this place?" she asked, stepping out of the car. "This," he said, taking her hand, "is our home, or it will be." Alice stared at him, confused. "I thought we were going to live in your penthouse." "The penthouse is my fortress," he said gently. "I want to build a home with you, and I figured who better to restore it than the best in the business." She looked from his hopeful, loving face to the beautiful, broken house. It needed everything: a new foundation, a restored roof, windows that didn't rattle in the wind. It was a massive project, a labor of love. It was perfect. "It will take years," she said, a slow smile spreading across her face. "We have years," he replied, pulling her close. "We have the rest of our lives." As they stood there, planning the restoration of their future home, Alice's thoughts drifted briefly to Dan. She had heard through the grapevine that he had lost his job shortly after the gala. The firm couldn't tolerate the public scandal. He had sold his apartment and moved away, back to the Midwest, people said. She didn't know for sure, and she realized with a profound sense of peace that she didn't care. His redemption, if it ever came, was his own story to write. It had nothing to do with her. Her redemption was here. It was in the solid ground beneath her feet, in the scent of eucalyptus and salt in the air, in the challenging, beautiful project that lay before her. It was in the hand of the good man standing beside her, a man who saw all of her, the broken pieces and the restored beauty, and loved her not in spite of them, but because of them. She had spent so long restoring the past for others, but now she was finally restoring her own. She was taking the old, forgotten foundation of the woman she once was and building a spectacular new life upon it, a life filled with light, purpose, and a love as timeless and enduring as the buildings she saved. And it was more beautiful than anything she could have ever designed. The wedding was not a grand affair. There were no reporters, no society columns, no crowds of onlookers. They were married on a crisp autumn afternoon on the newly reinforced porch of the still under-construction farmhouse in Marin. The guests were a small collection of their closest friends, family, and the artisans from Alice's team who were, quite literally, helping to build their home. Alice wore a simple cream-colored wool dress. Nathaniel wore a tweed jacket. There were no photographers, only an old Polaroid camera that was passed among the guests, capturing candid, joyful moments that would be taped to the unfinished walls. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, promising not a perfect, easy life, but one of partnership, respect, and shared adventure. As Nathaniel slipped a simple, elegant gold band onto her finger to sit beside the engagement ring, Alice looked out at the view of the bay, the city a glittering, distant jewel. She thought of the woman who had cried in a condo in that city, the woman who had felt her life was over. She thought of the woman who had found solace in dust and decay, and the woman who had stood tall in a ballroom and reclaimed her own story. They were all parts of her, layers of varnish and paint stripped away to reveal the strong, beautiful grain underneath. Later, as the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the construction site, Alice found herself standing alone by a newly framed window, looking at a set of blueprints. Nathaniel came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "What are you looking at, Mrs. Sterling?" he murmured into her hair. She smiled, leaning back against him. "Just the plans for the library," she said, her finger tracing the outline of the room. "I think we can fit in another bookshelf here." He kissed her shoulder. "Whatever you think is best. You're the architect." In that simple statement, she felt the entirety of their love. He trusted her vision. He believed in her expertise. He saw her not as an extension of himself, but as his brilliant, capable partner. The life she was living now was not a fairy tale. It hadn't been bestowed upon her by a prince. It was a structure she had designed herself, built with her own two hands on a foundation of her own making. The pain of her past was not erased, but it had been integrated, repurposed, made a part of the history of the house she was building, a house strong enough to withstand any storm. And as the first stars began to appear in the twilight sky, Alice Callahan Sterling knew with a quiet, unshakable certainty that she was finally home. Alice's journey wasn't about revenge, it was about redemption, not redemption in the eyes of the man who wronged her, but in her own. It's a powerful reminder that our lowest moments can be the foundation for our greatest achievements, and that your value is never determined by someone else's inability to see it. If you were moved by Alice's story of resilience and empowerment, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who might need to hear this message. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next story. And I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments below. What was the most powerful moment in Alice's journey for you? Thank you for watching.